Welcome to our review of the brand new 2022 NordicTrack RW900 Rower. We're going to be looking in depth at what makes this rower unique and how it compares with the previous model of last year. Because obviously there have been a ton of significant changes made. And I say changes rather than improvements because it seems that with this new design, while NordicTrack took a few steps forward, there were many steps taken back here. My name is Colin with Connect the Watts, and if that sounds good to you, hit that like button and let's get started. You know, for the most part, I'm a big fan of NordicTrack and iFit, and I have tested out almost all of their newly redesigned equipment for 2022. And so far, these redesigns have been excellent upgrades. The new S27i bike was actually better than I was expecting and is now easily one of the best connected fitness bikes currently available. The new redesigns of almost all of NordicTrack's treadmills are outstanding, and they are currently my favorite treadmills to use. Their new RW900 Rower, though, I'm not sure what happened here. Of course, I'm going to talk all about it, but it feels like this rower was designed by somebody or a team of people who are not rowers, or maybe don't completely understand what makes a rower good. Because while a lot of these changes may look good or look nice, in many cases, they actually make the rowing experience worse. So let's first get into what has changed here for the better. The visual design obviously has been completely rehauled and is very much improved. Whereas last year's model wasn't particularly great looking. It looked a little cheap, and it was one of those rowers where you probably didn't want to have it displayed out in your living room. You would probably just hide it behind your desk or in the garage somewhere. This new rower, though, is meant to be displayed and really looks incredible. Also improved here are the new 30-watt speakers on the front of the screen, which are a good amount better than last year's model, which had a few weaker speakers in the back of the tablet. There's also been a huge change here in the resistance type, and we're going to talk about this more in depth when we talk about some of the negatives of this unit, but the positives is that the change of moving the magnetic resistance to a spin wheel, which is a lot more quiet than the air fan used in last year's model. Also to note here, which may be a positive or a negative, kind of depending on who you are, is that the seat on the new RW900 is much higher relative to your feet than last year's model. What it does is it allows those who may be a little bit more tight in their hamstrings or their hips to be able to get into a better position in the catch or the return. Personally, I thought last year's model was just a bit too low, and I feel like this one is just a hair too high, but I really don't mind it. But I do appreciate that it is there to help more people achieve better form while they row. Also new to this year's model is finally an on and off switch near the front, so you no longer have to unplug your rower if you want to turn it off. What hasn't changed but is still great here is the rotating screen, which allows you to take classes off of the rower like their strength or yoga workouts, and also the excellent Velcro feet straps, which are really the best designed foot straps of any rower that I have ever used. But despite all of these new improvements, the number of issues with this new rower far outnumber them, so much so that it's actually hard for me to know where to start. So let's just start with what's most obvious here first. Because of the new redesign of the RW900, it means that the rower can no longer be folded in half like it could previously. And really, one of my favorite things about having a rower for your home is that it takes up so little space when you're not using it, because you can usually either fold it in half or store it upright. And while you can store this rower upright, it's not going to be stable or safe while doing so. So in order to store it safely, you're going to have to build your own kind of contraption, maybe with bungee cords or some sort of latch, to make sure this 200-pound rower isn't going to come crashing down on someone. Now, one of the biggest changes to this year's model is that the resistance has been changed from using an air fan with magnetic resistance to just magnetic resistance with a weighted flywheel. And as I mentioned earlier, this does make the rower a lot more quiet, but at the cost of a few big issues. First of which is that the resistance here feels incredibly weak. You know, the highest resistance here doesn't feel much higher than the lowest resistance of the previous model. And that would be the biggest issue in the world if this flywheel didn't also fundamentally change how it feels to row. See, if you've never rowed before or understand the mechanics of rowing, you may not realize this, but being able to change your resistance on your rower isn't necessarily something that you have to do all the time, if at all. Because with rowing, how it's supposed to feel and how it usually feels with like an air rower or a water rower or even other magnetic rowers is that the harder you pull, the more resistance you feel, which is why on most rowers, it's not even really considered changing your resistance rather than just your damper settings, which is basically a fancy way of saying what sort of feeling are you trying to simulate during this row, because you can usually get a really good workout no matter which damper setting you have. It's more about having your own preference. But with this flywheel, if you pull really hard, it doesn't provide additional resistance, which not only feels really strange by itself, but paired with the low resistance levels, it makes the problem even worse. And last year's model didn't have this issue at all. It had an air fan and magnetic resistance, and that air fan did provide that feeling of the harder you pull and the more resistance you feel. And the magnetic resistance on the previous model was more there as like a minor adjustment that could sort of be adjusted by the coach for the class you were taking for, but really the biggest adjustment was going to be that damper setting by how open or closed you had that air fan. So when you row on the 2022 model compared to last year's, it just feels a lot worse. And unfortunately, this is just one problem, and there are many, many more. So another issue is the pullback of the handle, because on a good rower, you want it to feel snappy. You want to have that snappy feeling where the handle is getting pulled back to the rower as you return it. And while last year's model wasn't necessarily the best at this, it was definitely adequate. Whereas this year's model, the pullback doesn't have any of that snappiness or quickness at all. And even the handle here, which has been designed and looks nicer and longer than last year's model, it's also less comfortable because it's made out of solid plastic compared to last year's rower, which had a thin layer of rubber to make the grip feel a little better. And now let's talk about how this new redesign changes your positioning and comfort while sitting on the rower, because the rower here is a lot more thick, which means that the distance between your feet is going to be wider. So last year's model had about 11 inches of distance between the center of each of your heels, which is a bit wider than some other rowers, but is still on par with what is considered normal. This year, that distance has been increased by about 2 inches, meaning that your feet are placed far wider than I have ever seen on any rower before. And for me at least, it puts me in a position that doesn't feel as comfortable or natural to row in. And I'm a 190-pound guy. I'd imagine that if somebody is smaller than me, then this problem is going to be even more of an issue. Then we have the new foot pad design, and as I mentioned, I do really like the Velcro feet straps that they've kept here. They're really great at keeping your feet just locked in while you row. But the issue with this new redesign is that the foot pad that holds your heel is less flexible. So when you come forward during your row, the foot pad isn't able to come up enough to allow for the right amount of ankle flexion, causing your foot and sock to move up and down relative to your shoe. I've never had or seen this problem on any rower before, including last year's model. So it's not a shoe issue, it's just the flexibility of the foot pad. Then let's talk about the screen placement, because that too has been changed and not for the better. Previously, you were able to adjust the screen height to where you would like it, whereas here the screen is sort of stuck in one spot, and that screen position just happens to be too high for most people to be able to look at it with good form. See, to understand why this is an issue, you need to understand midline stabilization. And what that means is you need to have a straight line from your hips all the way to the top of your head. And as you move forward in the row, you want to be able to keep this alignment. But by having the screen high, if you want to keep your eyes on the screen, you're going to have to do a chicken neck. And this chicken necking, as we call it, is not a great movement to do for your upper neck over and over and over again. Additionally, they did make the screen with the ability to tilt up and down slightly, but personally I have found this to be designed so tightly that it's almost impossible to move it up or down safely. And then if that wasn't enough, there's an even bigger issue, and that the meters that are displayed here are horribly inaccurate. And this isn't just for the newer model, this is just an algorithm issue on the software that's a problem for both rowers. So for example, if I row an average of a 2 minute per 500 meter pace, I should hit 500 meters at exactly 2 minutes. That would make sense, right? But that's not what happens here. See, when I row a 2 minute per average pace here, I achieve 500 meters in about 1 minute and 40 seconds. And while that number may sound small, it's actually really, really huge when it comes to rowing. So I don't know, like, Like, this rower just has so many issues that I would honestly, if you want to buy a NordicTrack rower, I would really try to find the previous model at this point until some of these changes are fixed, or at least the ones that can be. Now, in terms of the program and the classes that these rowers run on, some of the programs and coaches are decent. I wouldn't say they're anywhere near the quality that iFit has for their bikes and treadmills. They don't seem to really put as much effort into their rowing workouts, and the number of series and programs and the frequency of how often new ones are put out seem quite a bit less than they do for some of their other equipment. For those looking for live classes, there's also no live classes at this point for the rower. And the Google Map feature where you can create your own rides like on their bike and on their tread, that's still here, even though it makes no sense at all because they don't have Google images of the water. So if you create a route for yourself, it doesn't work. There's no pictures or anything that actually shows up. So look, I'm really just trying to wrap my head around some of these design decisions and how they were made. Because last year's rower, now it wasn't amazing or anything, but it was pretty decent. And despite some of the issues, I still think it would be a pretty good fit for somebody who is an iFit member with a bike or a treadmill and they want to expand their home gym. But for this new model, it's really hard to suggest it, even for hardcore iFit fans. And with how good their designs are for their bikes and their treadmills, I feel like there's no reason they can't create an excellent rower as well. But this one really isn't it. Now, if you want to hear my thoughts and reviews on NordicTrack's new treadmills, well, make sure to check that video out here because those are really excellent. Thanks as always for watching. If this video helped you out in any way, make sure to subscribe for more content just like this, and I'll see you next time.